Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. Tonight is Christmas Eve, and as I wait for my partner and her family to get back from watching some house in their neighborhood play Perfect Circle to its own rave-worthy coordinated light show, something I didn't even know was happening, but I mean, it is 2018. I think we are kind of behind relative to our expectations. So it's little things like this that remind me that we are in fact making incremental gains and that progress is not total bullshit. Well, it's on nights like tonight that I'm glad, although somewhat naked, to admit that forgetting the dongle for this computer audio setup, I'm able to record this intro on the vastly improved microphone in my laptop. Yeah, you know, the present that is our past future is not so bad. And for all of the dark twists that I take in this show, I really just want you to know how grateful I am for the opportunity to walk with you, at least conceptually, right, into the next. I think we have clearly established on this show that time is neither simply linear nor simply cyclical, but fractal and higher dimensional than any of us can understand. So that's why the future continues to surprise itself with its revivals and exhumations, why the past continues to surprise us with its advanced futurity. It all comes down to where you're standing on the fractal. There is no future. There are locations, local optima, places where potential folds in on itself under its own weight until it is actually Christmas. And in what I think Jean Gebser would have recognized as an integral apprehension of time, there is, in the collective turning of attention into the silent and holy of a night, into that space of potential and Noel, the novel, the new novelty, the first ingress of novelty, a divine spark, a kind of archaic initiation around which has accreted a kind of magical significance, around which has congealed great myth, around which grows a system of meaning and value, from which myth is consciously grown, around which an acknowledgement of otherness and the relational reality of our being grows if we are lucky. I mean, if we have a suitably complex environment that requires this of us, and then the strange loop of selfhood can turn back upon itself, acknowledge its own automatic and reflexive nature. You know, follow that guiding star to the manger where the seat of the soul rests. Be your own wise men and visit your own birth. Whatever it is you celebrate, it's a fine time to decode the myth, tune into that magic, and as a deeply rational and empirical act, look as far upstream as you can to the very moment of the origin of you in this. It's constantly renewing because you are a self-assembling process thing. You're continuous. You don't click in and out of being. You're assembled and you constantly make do from what's around. But even though for the conveniences of your own story, you declare a start, an end, you don't. And this is hard for some of us to live with. I know, but anyway. I think that ultimately it is healthy, wise, and good to recognize your continuity with everything. And Merry Christmas. We have an awesome guest this week. It's Tricia Eastman. She leads people through encounters with a deeper, wider, and more networked self and world than they usually have access to. File this one under episodes in which we deal with trauma and discuss the resurrection of the cultural modalities that let us deal with trauma in a better way. But also, as you know, I am quite fond of questions of the validity and the solidity of the things that we witness when we're vulnerable, and challenge our cognition and its biases, even as I say some things that I can't believe when I hear myself saying them editing this episode. So, enjoy. Tricia Eastman, it's a pleasure to have you on Future Fossils.
Yay! I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. It's an honor.
So, let's see, where were we? In the general scheme of things, we're thinking about one of the big things that we could just start with is the archaic revival, right? Because we're here.
Yes.
You are an entheogenic practitioner. I am obsessed with looking at cultural retrieval and how a new era sort of dredges up that which the previous era repressed.
Yes.
And there's so many different ways that this is coming out. So let's sort of orbit that as we talk about how you got into the work and the kind of work that you do. You know, how you were sort of drawn into it and how you see it in the bigger picture of stuff. And we can, take that whichever way you want.
Beautiful. Okay.
How did you become a medicine practitioner?
So it's an interesting story. I never had any inkling that this was going to be my future. I hate to use the word career because it's really my life's mission, my dharma, you could call it. And it started because I, when I was really young, worked at a counterculture bookstore called Raver Books.
Where was this?
And we, in Seattle, Washington.
Okay.
On Capitol Hill. And we would throw these illegal underground parties. And, people would take too much medicine, take too much MDMA mixed with LSD, mixed with, cannabis and have a really hard time. And I would be kind of the mother and hold space for those people. Sometimes, and interestingly, it ended up like even getting older into my 30s when I got married, which I'm divorced now, going to festivals in Miami, like Ultra Music Festival. And at the time, there wasn't any psychedelic first aid. And they had psychedelic first aid would be like Zendo Project, where they have the stations at Burning Man or at Lightning in a Bottle. And if you're having a challenging experience, it's a place to lay down, to get support, and to just feel safe and have people support you through a challenging experience. So they didn't have that at festivals until recently, and not all festivals even have that service available for attendees. And I used to go to a lot of electronic music festivals growing up. So I ended up kind of being, again, like there'd be two girls and, they'd be 13, 14 years old, and, there'd be some creepy guys around them, and they are having a hard time taking too many medicines and, too much LSD and too much, whatever else they were taking. And I would kind of say, oh, come with me and we'll take care of you, and hang out with them and make sure they were safe and make sure they had enough water. So fast forward, I'm in my 30s, really unhappy. I've built the perfect life, though. Like, what seems from the surface is the perfect life, but I'm really unhappy. And so I take some MDMA and I go on this journey. And in the journey, I have this deep realization. I literally make contact with an entity that I experienced as like an angelic being that basically said it was time for me to go find myself. And this was about 9 years ago that this happened. And within several months of that time, I decided that I was on the wrong path. And so I literally left behind my husband, my 4 houses, all my material possessions. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that I needed to be of service to humanity. I knew that whatever I was doing, I needed to make a switch and find that thing that I could give as a gift to the world. And so it was like my hero's journey. And in that process, I had been reading this book called Plant Spirit Medicine. And actually, I'm sorry, it's Plant Spirit Healing by Pam Grout. And in the book, she talks about ayahuasca. And I'm thinking, I live in Seattle, Washington, very, there isn't really a lot of that, psychedelic subculture like there is in places like Los Angeles. And I literally thought I was going to have to go to the jungle and have this experience. I went to Europe, actually, for 5 months, traveled, had some very powerful spiritual visions through meditation practice, and realized that I needed to move to Los Angeles. Literally, right when I got off the plane, I met someone at this really cool place called Cafe Gratitude, which is this really awesome place where, all the meals are affirmations, and it's really meant to set this positive, loving place, including how, the owners take care of their employees in, just a very conscious way. And I met this really interesting person. They're like, oh, I'm going to an ayahuasca ceremony this weekend. You want to go with me? And so literally I had my first ayahuasca experience in the Hollywood Hills with a curandera from Colombia, an ayahuasca shaman. And it was a really powerful experience for me. I didn't realize, just working with that medicine again, that I wasn't going to be facilitating myself. I never had that inkling in my mind. And then literally several months later, I met this owner of a clinic in Mexico that does ibogaine treatment for heroin addiction. And his name is Martin Polanco. And I met him actually at a festival. And I said to him, what do you think about ibogaine for eating disorders? Because I had severe, debilitating eating disorders that had kind of ruled my life since I was 10 years old. And I really wanted to get down to the core of how to love myself and how to love my body and accept myself fully. So I went to Mexico. He actually decided to do kind of a little experiment with me. And I went down to Mexico, and literally I'm laying in a bed next to someone who's going through a heroin detox, which was pretty intense. And again, it was the most powerful experience of my life. It was the first time I had truly seen myself as that connection to that web of life, to all things, and saw in that singularity oneness, the complete oneness. And I was able to just fully love and accept myself. And I just remember crying for probably, I don't even know, it felt like 2 hours. It was a very long experience. The whole ibogaine journey that I was on lasted for probably about 24 hours. And at the very end of the journey, this is all happening at this house in Rosarito, which is in Baja, Mexico, I got to receive this medicine that comes from the venom of the Sonoran desert toad, which is 5-MeO-DMT. Mm-hmm. And again, just like complete, dissolving into oneness, into just that connection to all things. And it permanently shifted the way that I saw myself and saw the world in terms of being connected to all things. And I asked the medicine while I was in the medicine space, because I was just so grateful for this being available for me. How can I be of service? And within 3 weeks, the owner of the clinic asked me if I could assist in facilitating the psychospiritual program for the clinic. And that's kind of what launched my career into the medicine, which later eventually led me to being initiated into the Dasumba branch of Bwiti, working with the powerful medicine iboga, as well as facilitating retreats internationally all over the world with iboga and Bufo alvarius.
Wow. So there is something in there that I deeply resonate with, which is the history of watching spun kids flip out at festivals with no one there around to protect or guide them or sit them, to use the trip term. And, this is a theme that comes up again and again on the show, which is rebooting lost continuity, reestablishing these traditions whereby a culture of youth rediscovers the value and significance of elders, where our obsession with the first third of a person's life is tempered, and we realize that we do actually need intergenerational education and presence and discourse, and that there is, in a space as complex and confusing as the contemporary world is. I mean, I think it's always been true. It's always been true that human beings would have been better off with an aunt or an uncle or, someone there outside of the nuclear, what we call the nuclear family, which is itself sort of this weird atomistic, reduced version of the village, right? Like atoms don't exist on their own. They exist, in molecules or in gases or crystals or whatever. And there's something about, I've told festivals over the years, you may be hiring me to play music or to paint or whatever, but really you're also hiring me because above board, you can't hire a psychedelic harm reduction team for this event because legally it incriminates you in drug activity. Ever since the Rave Act, from the 90s, people don't, that this is a huge piece of this. This is why, America is so far behind Europe in this regard, or so much of Europe, that we have this thing where somebody throwing the event or the venue hosting the event can be criminally liable if they, as drug dealers, if they put these kind of cautionary measures in place, if they're trying to save kids from fishing out, taking too much or whatever. And so, we're in this weird spot where, one, the necessity of guides in the complexity of the spaces that we're inhabiting, psychedelic or not. And then the other is having to do it underground. Like, you started this by talking about how these were underground parties. It wasn't woven into the culture. And so I'm curious, how it is for you to work in this space, to deal with these tensions as a public figure, working in a space that's legally very contentious, where sometimes you have a religious defense and sometimes you don't, and how it is to have to sort of smuggle the sacred into the global shopping mall, basically.
Yeah, it's a really delicate balance, because it really is important in this work to set it up in a way that everything that you could possibly need is set up perfectly. And then there is also this thing with capitalism getting involved. And how can we integrate just like the old temples, the old, like the Knights of Templar, where a big part of the religious aspect or spiritual aspect was commerce, sacred commerce, so you could say. And so I think that there is an important balancing point with the medicines becoming so public, with things like the cannabis industry, where we don't want it to be too commercialized. We want to keep the integrity of that. And at the same time, we also have this huge issue of legality. I mean, the truth is this. Right now, we are at a point that every time, and this is what I've understood from just the different government and legal conversations that I've had, is, the Native American church is such a gift. It's such a blessing that we have that available to us. And it's kind of being allowed. It's really interesting. The UDV, Church of Santo Daime, they actually have federal agents that come in and check the log of who came through, and just like if they were going in and checking other places that have controlled substances. So, it's definitely something that the government knows about, police know about. And at the same time, there's this interesting situation in that if they make any huge, and I hate to use words like they, by the way. If these structures that exist currently, our system, which is not for us being able to have cognitive liberty and freedom to use the substances that we want, and instead set up safe structures for us. If they were to go after these underground ceremonies, which I do most of my work internationally, by the way, so I try to be really careful in that line, since I do talk on a lot of podcasts and, do a lot of workshops and things talking about, psychedelics in many different realms. And if they were to, let's say, for instance, start shutting down like underground ayahuasca ceremonies, like the way that I first experienced it when I moved to Los Angeles, they would have such a blowback because basically any person that got shut down could countersue and say that they are impeding religious rights. And so right now we're kind of in this little space, this little nook where if we're really careful in how we go about it and the languaging that we use, and just being really kind of, using things like the Signal app, to talk about things like that, we're kind of in this little safe zone. And I do believe, and I believe this really strongly from connecting with the medicines and having the medicines talk to me about this, that there is some protection, that the medicines are protecting those that are doing this work in a good way. At the same time, I do feel that there's so much opportunity because we're so limited, number one, in resources, number two, in communication, because doing like things in that way, like underground, doesn't allow you to really spread the word in a way that you can build a movement and get people together that all have an agreement. Like, hey, we'd like to have this available. Let's buy this building over here and open a church so that we can do 5-MeO legally in a way that it makes it more accessible to others. And I think that's going to be the next phase, because if you look at the route of the FDA, legalization, even MAPS, that was a 25-year battle just to get MDMA approved, which is now going to be at the expanded access level, which means it won't be covered for insurance purposes, but people for, I think the number is, and please don't take this literally, but I had heard $30,000 for 3 treatments of psychedelic assisted therapy, MDMA, for PTSD, and 15 sessions of integration psychotherapy included in that whole package. But it's not, not most people aren't going to be able to do that. And that's kind of the way that they've gotten the approval, like the green light for 2019, from what I understand.
Yeah, I think a lot of those Because we're talking about, you bringing up the expanded access. This is facilities that are making this available to people even before it's available through a health, through that insured provider, which is a couple years further still down the road.
Yep.
So there are going to be, when I heard Rick Doblin speaking about this earlier this year, he said that based on what he knew, that there would be thousands of these treatment centers opening up in the next couple of years that were,
yes.
As far as, I guess maybe that's another place to take this, which is not just the preventative piece of it, but especially given your work with Iboga, the post-traumatic piece of it. I was just talking with Zach Stein on a recording yesterday, and I asked him what he thought the future was going to look and feel like. And Zach Stein is a Harvard-educated psychologist and a member of the MetaModernists. This what comes after modernity, and he just wrote this really beautiful piece about love in the time between worlds, about the resurgence of metaphysics and like a metaphysics of love and human being as necessary, guiding us through this sort of transitional period. But when I asked him about this, he said specifically he thought that a big piece of what we were going to have to work through together was the post-tragedy of, waking up in the middle of a burning house, and maybe we kind of put the fire out before the whole house burns down, but we still lost a lot in that process.
Yes.
Maybe we saved one rhino species, but we lost the other 3. So it's that's everywhere. And so a big piece of this is the aftermath. And I'm curious to hear you speak as a facilitator about what it is to come in and do that work with people who, I think, like all of us, are carrying some extraordinary wound just for participating in this world.
Yeah.
And so how is that?
I think the more that we can understand the structures of the mind, the more that we can transcend trauma. And I think that the consciousness mapping that's happened through, the different mystical traditions, as well as through, these fabulous psychonauts who have written a bunch of amazing books about their experiences and just the similarities between all of that. I feel that what we're moving into is a world that really is about understanding how to face our shadow, understanding how to face our darkness, really understanding how to have those hard conversations with people. Because a lot of our trauma is around human interaction. That's why we have so much war on our planet. And so a lot of the decisions that we make are basically false structures of safety, structures that make us feel safe, like locking your door. Does locking your door really actually make you safe? If someone wants to get into your house, they're going to get into your house. And people are intelligent. That's just one example. But the truth is that we are all walking around with a lot of trauma. And that trauma exists within our egoic structure, our egoic framework, the part of us that is separate. And if we can understand and can be observers, and that's what these psychedelic medicines do, is they help us to be an observer and understand that is actually an aspect of us, it's not us. Then we can get into a space where we can start really interacting in a more peaceful way. And I feel that the reason we moved into these little, like you said in the beginning, single serve families versus like these tribal, groups of people is because we're walking around with so much trauma that's like our safe little box. Like our mom, our dad, our sister, our brother, these people aren't going to try to kill us or steal our money, or maybe they would still, but they're family, so that's okay. But so we have to really look at what is the future going to be? And I think like the Burning Man culture has been by far one of the biggest social, political, and spiritual movements of our time that I think is an example of how number one, it's brought back the rite of passage, which was something that was missing from our ancient culture, really having to go through that really challenging, hard experience in order to see your true nature. And the other piece is really about that idea of bringing community back together and co-creating and radical responsibility in your life in all areas, including cleaning up your shit, and I think that's where we're moving as a culture, is like energetic responsibility in all decisions that we make. And if we can operate from that space, we can restore the planet. And the downloads that I've received, and I don't want to get too woo-woo and weird, but I'll just say that.
Go ahead.
There are, from what I understand, from what I've experienced, and I highly recommend that if you haven't had that experience, maybe be curious, and if you have a mystical experience, maybe go in with the questioning of this. But there are benevolent beings that are assisting the ascension of the planet and assisting us in really coming back into harmony. And I feel like once we get to a certain point of our own sovereignty within ourselves, of taking responsibility for the world that we want for ourselves, that we're going to receive a lot more assistance. And there's going to be like just transmissions of, okay, here's a new technology to take plastic out of the ocean. Here's a new technology to heal Fukushima. And so I think the more that we just keep creating containers to connect, to connect within into our inner wise person, but also to connect in community and kind of share our best practices of how we're connecting, then that's going to really be a massive shift to the planet. And I believe anything is possible because we've never done this before. We are forging new territories and we are pioneering the future. And so this is an opportunity for all of us to, through our responsibility, through our radical responsibility, so, Burning Man language, to really take charge and decide, you know what, I want 50 species of dolphins on my planet. I'm not letting that happen. Okay, let's do this.
So you brought it up, and it's been a theme on the show recently. Every single conversation that we've had involving psychedelics has raised the issue of the beings that we encounter in these spaces. And it is a persistent, who is it? Phil Dick says reality is that which, if you stop believing in it, does not go away. There's something about the persistence of these experiences among even the hardcore atheists, skepticist trippers out there that are still encountering these beings. And so I don't know. I don't think that it's insofar as anecdote pluralized is data, right? I think that we have a kind of a closet effect of people having these experiences and thinking that they're woo-woo and being like awkward talking about them. But I have spilled my guts about this stuff on a couple episodes recently, my own UFO encounters and that kind of thing. So I'd love to hear, even though it may be kind of a detour, I'd love to hear you talk about how you came to a sense of acceptance that this is a valid experience, and that and how you feel like seeing the world in this way has, I don't know, what has it done for you and your practice and the way that you actually live your life?
Thank you. I mean, it's really interesting because when I was really young, I had these experiences where I would encounter negative entities, not necessarily negative. I mean, they were scary to me. As a kid, I was afraid of them. And I grew up in a really Christian family, and my parents actually sent me to the pastor of the church, and they did this ceremony, basically like what it equivalates to try to close my third eye, because I had a really open third eye. So my whole life, I would see these like ghosts and different things. And it got to the point when I was in my 30s, when I was traveling a lot, I'd stay in these old hotels and people would I literally would have things come into my room at night and I would just drink. I'd be like, hey, you can't bug me if I'm passed out. If I drink this bottle of wine, this ghost cannot fuck with me, you know? And so I would do that. I would just be like, okay, I just need a bottle tonight and until I started understanding that all they wanted was to be shown to the light. And that, you know, part of my purpose was to help these different lost energies to find their way home. And interestingly, as I went through this awakening experience, a big phase of my awakening experience was leaving my matrix job, working for myself, and in that process getting really fascinated with healing work and studying a lot of these modalities, you know, different bioenergetic healing modalities. And when I started studying them, I would get these visitations at night from different, there were these blue beings that I think were blue avians. It seems to be a common descriptor that I've heard from having conversations with other people. I had other types of angelic beings, and I would have, I remember this one time when I literally first had this experience of waking up where I had this ball that came above me while I was in bed sleeping. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm sleeping next to the guy. This is a guy that I was dating at the time after my divorce. And literally this ball is talking to me telepathically. And I'm not on any psychedelics, by the way. And there's fire coming out of it, and it looks almost like the sun, but more gaseous and fiery. And it tells me to put my hands and my feet up. So here I'm laying in bed, and I've got my hands straight up in the air and my feet straight up in the air, and it starts sending this energy through my hands, and I start shaking. And it was telling me, it was giving me this light body upgrade type of, I didn't fully understand it, but I definitely felt it, and I knew something was happening, and it didn't feel like it was negative, and I didn't feel negative afterwards. And then as these experiences continued, I was very fortunate because my best friend at the time, someone who we had spent 7 years together in this kind of path of this deep spiritual work, as we were kind of initiated at the same time, which one night she was with me, and literally these blue avians came in the room, and they started working on us and giving us light body activations. And I know this sounds so weird, and
we don't know how weird it will sound to people 100 years from now.
Yeah, that's true.
They might be yeah, those guys, or they might be all humans were insane.
Yeah, 100 years ago we were totally crazy. And so then these beings literally, my friend was having the exact same experience as me. And I remember one time one of the beings was saying something to me. It was telling me to kneel in front of the bed, and I kind of just stood there, and I looked over at my friend, and she's like, it said to kneel in front of the bed. Did you hear him? And I was like, okay. So I was I wanted to make sure I wasn't seeing and hearing things. And so yeah, it was such an interesting phenomena. And many people in DMT experiences see beings and entities. And I do believe that this is a part of the collective consciousness. I can't necessarily say what that's all about. And I think it's more, again, one of those things I encourage people to be curious about.
Yeah, again, to draw in the metamodernist view here, the metamodernist articulation of science is that, what we're moving into is much more humble, and it's provisional. So we come up with an idea, but we never rest on it forever. We're never satisfied. We know that you look at the people who are speaking from the state of the art 100 years ago, and some of the stuff, even the most intelligent visionary people, was just painfully out, except for Rudolf Steiner. For whatever reason, that guy in 1915 gave a talk about meteoric iron and the sulfur of the dragon and like the iron being like associated with Archangel Michael. And he talked about this whole thing about the iron falling from the skies with the meteors as the dragon rises up as the life force from Earth. And I was like, dude, Luis Alvarez, this is a total tangent, but whatever. Luis Alvarez came up with the comet impact hypothesis for the end of the dinosaurs in 1980. And Steiner was talking about it in 1915. And I was like, whoa. So at any rate, most of us are not that astute. The point being that I think that it's just vastly more enjoyable to admit that we don't know what the hell is going on, and to look to, like you said, like you did, to look to the fruits of these experiences in your actual life. It's not just about whether it makes you feel good in the moment, but like, does your interaction with this experience, you know, as you're processing it down the line, what kind of effects does it have? And it's like an opportunity for curiosity. And this is something I'd be really curious to hear you talk about as a facilitator, because as a facilitator, you get these, anybody who's been through, I've never done iboga, but I've done ayahuasca ceremony a few times, and there is a palpable moment in some of these where something enters the room, and everyone there is aware of it, and everyone there is reacting to it in their, their sort of way. And even if it is, if you just like wave it away as a consensual hallucination, I mean, so is, the two-party system. So like the fact is that it's persistent. And what I notice in these spaces is that some people come out of these experiences being like, yeah, we had to ward ourselves against these demonic presences, like this, like you said, you're like, well, I found it scary. I'm not saying it was negative. And I think that there's something in people are so inclined to regard another entity as an other, as something outside of themselves. And you just said that a huge piece of this is in re-internalizing everything and owning all this stuff. And I think there's something about it, especially with my experience of like ghosts. There's something about, even if it's not like, even if the ghost is sort of a discrete personality, that I'm like in a conversation with, one ghost in particular that sort of tagged along with me over the years. So now you're free from being weird, right? I've announced myself as vastly weird. But this presence, there's something about taking emotional responsibility for her that changes her appearance in my life, changes the way that her presence is felt by those close to me, who I'm not the only one who has experienced this being. And so in a way, it's almost like the right thing to do is to treat it as though it's yours, in a sense, not like it's something that you need to like lock in the basement again. But I'm curious how this stuff comes up in your experience, and how you advise people to relate to these matters.
Well, I think that when we look at, for instance, the dream time, and we look at psychedelic experiences, at least the medicines that I work with the most, which is the 5-MeO and the iboga, both activate the REM in the brain, which is activating the subconscious mind. And the whole idea behind all of these is activating that subconscious. And so when you look at the subconscious, all it's doing is trying to communicate to you. And the subconscious, basically, I like to think of it like, when you're playing Pictionary and you draw the picture and then you're like, starts with a C, but you have to communicate it in a way that would be understandable to the person that you're trying to communicate. The subconscious doesn't necessarily have a language. I mean, it can speak to you, but it's only speaking to you through your interpretation of what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. And so I really believe that whatever these things are that are coming up, they have some aspect of self, meaning there is something there for you. There's a message for you, something that you need to receive, to learn, to let go of. And that, I think, also includes these things that show up in the physical reality that typically tend to show up when we're alone, when we're in a certain state of consciousness, when our brain waves are in a certain state. It's not like you're like driving the car, and although I wouldn't say that couldn't happen, but they usually happen in kind of a certain type of energy. Like I notice like in the evening, or when the body is in a more restful place. And so I do believe that these are messages that are important. And I think the more that we try to separate them from ourselves, the more that they aren't able to give you that message. And so the most important thing is to look at, for instance, if you're having these visions, what does this person represent for you? Like, what are they, what aspect of self are they representing? And what could this be a reflection of in your life?
Mm. Yeah, that's very balanced. I remember, like Carl Jung talked about the gods as possibly an internal representation of messages from the body, from like the different organ systems. And, that's why they're transcultural. That's why you get the same sort of beings appearing in the East and West, separated by thousands of miles and years and all that stuff. And so that there is, even it maybe getting caught up on the sort of objective, empirical, or external is a mistake. I like your emphasis on focusing on the content of it, although the medium is the message, right? So there is this sense in which there's something about it appearing to you in the form of an angelic visitation or whatever, that is sort of itself a crucial piece of that content, right? Like Terence McKenna and Jung both talked about that, about the UFO as a sort of wake-up call, that just the simple fact of its existence confounds us, and it like humbles us. Well, I don't know. Before we let's take a hairpin turn here, because before you and I got on this call, we were talking a little bit over email about the talk that you recently gave on integrating indigenous practices into the modern world. And I know that we touched on this a little bit already, but I'm curious. I mean, clearly that sort of no-nonsense, practical way of relating to entities is something that we hear about coming out of indigenous medicine work, that just sort of like, yeah, they're there, sometimes, it matters, sometimes it doesn't. That kind of like, meh, it's normal. And I'm curious, what else have you been learning about how the indigenous ways of knowing are enriching this work in particular, or in the way that we navigate a modern world in general?
I think the most important thing that the Indigenous wisdom brings to modern culture is the idea of really honoring all life. Every ceremony, whether it's the TP ceremony, using the peyote medicine put on by the Lakota or the Huicholes, or if it's, iboga, or, if it's ayahuasca. Every single aspect of these ceremonies have deep symbolism, and those symbolism is really about just really acceptance of life, the laws of nature. And I think the modern day tool for us as a society to really understand that, which I think if no one knows about this, do you know about the gene keys, Richard Rudd?
I've heard a little bit about this, but I'm not an expert in this area. It's where they took the 64 codons of DNA and then they compare it to the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it superimposes. And so it's really interesting when you understand through these different, because I really believe that we are holographic from what I understand of the way matter works, and, with the way science is evolving, actually confirming that there is a primary server that is basically just like a projector on a movie screen, sending that light, and then that light is bending and separating into different aspects of power, and that through these different aspects of geometries, such as the toroidal field, which is a Merkaba energy, can actually create different forms of density and matter. The way, and it's not that it's creating matter, it's the way that form is experienced has a different way. And so when you look at this I Ching or the gene keys, what it's doing is it's actually giving you the architectural map of that. It's showing, okay, in this phase, in this expression, this is the shadow, and every shadow has a gift. So each one of these gene keys, these 64, has a shadow, a gift, and a siddhi. And the siddhi is kind of like the superpowers that, they've talked about in the yogic traditions.
That's SIDDHI, listeners. That's not like city like New York. That's CD like telepathy or whatever.
So these superpowers are really our highest potentials, like our highest expression of ourselves. And so within that container of the 64, you have the, I would call it holographic sphere of reality, which is everything. And that includes you and me and all consciousness.
So specifically, it is the interbeing that you find as sort of the most vital piece of indigeneity bringing into this?
Yeah. So when you're in ceremony, what you're seeing these different laws of nature in action. How the fire is a representation of the masculine, but also a representation of the soul and transmutation and healing. The moon, how the moon has an effect on the energy of the ceremony, reflecting the inner world, reflecting the feminine, and, a very powerful force. And these different aspects in the ceremony that represent the masculine, the feminine, and even how the medicines work. For instance, iboga, peyote, San Pedro being more of a masculine medicine and how that behaves versus ayahuasca, DMT in general, mushrooms being more feminine. And so when you understand how these different pieces fit together, and this deep understanding gives you an acceptance of life. And then through that acceptance of life, you can start to look at the things that have caused suffering in your life, usually rooted in trauma, and be able to say, oh, okay, so that happened because this is something that was an aspect of life that was out of alignment. And then in coming into wholeness and forgiveness of that, bringing that flow back into your life, that flow of how nature just naturally is. And interestingly, these, I call them algorithms. Plants carry them, master plants carry them. It's the same patterns that are in a turtle shell or in a leaf. These algorithms are alignment with life. And the algorithms that are the opposite of that would be things like EMFs from your cell phone, things that create entropy. And so the more that we get into these ceremonies and we understand how to align with life, the more that we can really step into the highest expression of ourselves, because we are aligned with healing frequencies, and we're able to radiate in a vibration that's receptive.
So where do you see your work growing? Are you sort of, as a facilitator of these experiences, do you feel like you've sort of found your groove, or do you feel that this work is going to continue to exfoliate and carry you into new arenas? I don't know exactly how to put that, but just like, obviously there's something about this that doesn't quote unquote scale, right? Like the human interactive dimension to it is so, one-on-one or one-on-few, like a teacher. You can't teach the whole world. So how do you understand your own development through this and where it's taking you?
So I think that for me, I try to say with humility that I don't really know anything. I'm here in service, and so my plan is to keep showing up, every day. And hopefully, some of the form that I feel, that I sense that it's going to take, and not just with me, but just in general, is that I feel that there's going to be more of a collective role in facilitation, and that facilitation is going to become a really big part of life, like learning, for instance. Instead of having a teacher like the old patriarchal model, it will be more of a group learning experience where, when that group comes together with the right intention through a facilitator kind of really helping hold that space, that group is going to be of service, set themselves in service to allow individuals in the group to basically contribute in the way that's of highest service to the collective evolution of that learning experience, for the the highest expression of that learning experience. And so I think that's where the facilitator will be really valuable. And I would love to support more of those experiences happening. I also believe that we are the medicine. We don't necessarily need to take medicine. I think that we are going to get to the point where we've healed enough of our trauma that we can just be. And, I think that the more that, I can help support being a steward of the best practices with this work and helping spread that information, the more that I know that I can support it being carried out in a good way. And the truth is that with everything that's happening with MAPS, I believe that it will actually massively increase the demand for all these other indigenous traditions as well. It's not going to just be there. People are going to say, oh, well, if that's amazing, maybe I should just go to the jungle in Peru and have an experience with ayahuasca, or, have an experience with iboga in a retreat in Costa Rica, or whatever, starts calling them. But I feel like that's going to be kind of an initiation in the United States that's going to really expand the demand for this work. And so I think there are a lot of facilitators out there, because it is kind of the Wild West, that aren't necessarily, haven't done their own work. They haven't really done their own inner healing work to be able to be a reflection of neutral space. Because a lot of the core trauma that exists right now is really about being seen. It's, most of the trauma that people carry is usually from something that happened when they were really young, where they weren't fully seen for who they are, fully accepted. Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. So I think that when we can all really allow those facilitators to step forward in a place of their own wholeness, then they can bring forth the medicine in a way that's going to continue that healing process of allowing people to really be seen and held.
You raise an interesting point here, which is that as we become more aware of the fact that we carry trauma in the first place, and as we become more aware of the technologies by which this trauma can be it may not even be right to call it, healing. It's clearly a form of healing, but it's like it's more just sort of a renegotiation of the deal that you have with your wound, right?
Yeah.
It's not like the wound just completely goes away, but clearly the amount of facilitators that we're going to need, like you just said, is going to just explode. But we don't have systems sufficient to the training of all of these people. And yet we also, like you were talking about earlier in this call, we have to be careful not to allow, if I imagine certified iboga facilitator, from Iboga University or whatever, let me see your credentials, like that doesn't seem like the like that there may be piece of it, you know, but like we can't ever sort of go back to that sort of naive relationship to institutionally verified expertise. So how do you imagine the human species putting the correct social systems in place to like boot up all of the facilitators that we'll need in the next 20 or 30 years?
I feel that the first step is core foundational programs. So, whenever I look at, I have people that ask me on a regular basis, they're like, oh my gosh, I think I'm supposed to be a facilitator. And, for me, I really believe that the way that is it's not something that you seek, it finds you. And so when I really tune in and I find that someone has really truly gotten the calling, like they're ready for that, the first step is healing yourself. And so, that might be some vision questing, that might be doing some really powerful somatic therapy, like somatic experiencing or other forms of trauma work. But I really believe that the first step is going into the study of understanding the nature of trauma, how it works, and how to heal it. Because if you take someone who goes back into a trauma, like for instance, rape trauma, and they're operating in sympathetic nervous system where they're fully activated and you leave them there too long, you actually can fry their nervous system and you can actually reactivate the trauma and you can actually put them in a worse place than they were before. And this does happen. So I think like the first foundational stuff is really around understanding trauma therapy, studying trauma therapy. And then from there, if someone were to choose, for instance, going into the space of working with psychedelics, I would probably next phase really look into integration, like psychedelic integration as the second phase. And so what does it take to integrate that experience? What are the integrative practices? Having a really deep understanding of that. And that would involve, doing a lot of integration circles with others, like going to others, there's different course programs that you can study within that. Then from that space, maybe an apprenticeship with someone that you really admire, that you feel is doing really, really good work and doing it in a good way.
But don't come to them, right? Wait for them to come to you in a dream or something?
I think that whenever people say, oh, what medicine should I do next? Or what should I do? I always say, well, look for signs. Like, look in your reality for the signs that show up. So ask the question, outwardly, to get the reflection back from the universe. And for that, if someone was asking, oh, should I work with the toad medicine, with the Bufo alvarius, they'll ask that question, and almost every single time they'll say, yeah, I asked that question, then I started seeing toads everywhere. I mean, seriously, it happens. And so you can actually say, okay, well, am I really being called to be a facilitator? And then look for those signs of things that would lead to that. But it's so easy, because the way that trauma works is basically like a free radical. It takes that healthy electron, and then that one is unstable, and it's like seeking out its completion. And it's the same with trauma. The trauma creates this deep desire to complete itself. And so sometimes that could be instead, you might think it's the call of being a facilitator, but really it's actually the call to heal yourself.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful, because it's like you got to walk through that door either way, don't you?
Yeah. No matter what. Yeah.
You phrase this in an interesting way in terms of shifting the emphasis to a sort of receptive listening with this. And I'm curious, normally we wrap these up by... I ask guests, if you had a question for the unborn future listeners of this show, or if you had something to say to them, what would it be? How do you imagine into that space? But rather than giving you the sort of young, active, masculine, how do you imagine into that? I'd be curious if you sort of open your imagination or your intuition to that seed of a future, of potentiality. What in your receptive state do you actually perceive as futural? How do you think, not how do you think, right, but how do you feel into or from the world that is to come? What's it given you right now?
Oh my gosh, I see the most beautiful, perfect world. Like literally no plastic in the ocean, clean water, happy, healthy people, living in community, having healthy bodies. And I truly see this through the choices that we make, through this idea of, I hate to, it's the most easiest way to articulate it, but karma, like this borderline of making the choice that's from the heart versus from the head. And so really, like, the more that we can orient ourselves, so the trauma lives in the ego. And so when we look at this future is not about separation or egoic orientation. This future is about connection, the opposite of addiction, I say, which is, I think, what's created this world that we're living in, is seeking outside of ourself, is connection. And the connection is this idea of connecting to that inner wise person. And so I see this idea of the more that we listen, the more that we receive, us being able to make these higher aligned choices, and these higher aligned choices being ultimately an orientation of our highest expression of ourselves. Some people even call that your higher self. If you believe in that idea, you can use that as an idea. But the higher self, or this highest expression of yourself. So like being able to really listen. And so I see this world just being absolutely beautiful and perfect. And I see that it could happen really quickly if we all make the right choices. I see a tipping point where, the vibration of that alignment really just has an impact on those that are in suffering, and it creates a bridge to allow those that maybe aren't receiving these transmissions to also connect to. And so, I see us living in a perfect world.
I'll take it. Thanks. Yeah. Tricia, where can people find you? I mean, like, you've been so generous and available, and I get the sense that if someone had a question, that they could come to you. So how would people do that?
So I have a website which is really primarily focused on the retreats that I curate, which are really beautiful, really designed to create a feminine experience in the sense of having comfort and beauty, like in beautiful locations, and authentic medicine experiences. And that is psychedelicjourneys.com. And then I really believe the purpose of life is art. Like to create art, whether it's music, poetry, books, but a big aspect of our life is to create. And so my Instagram is just like an honor to all of the artists that create incredible psychedelic art, and that's at Psychedelic Journeys.
Nice. Awesome. Thanks. Anything else before we release you into the ether?
I love you, and I love all of you future fossils out there. Thank you so much for this beautiful opportunity, and I hope to have more conversations in the future about this. And I truly believe that if we all can connect our hearts together and hold that vibration, that we will create that new world, that new earth.
It's beautiful, Tricia. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod Network, along with many other excellent shows. I highly recommend going to mindpodnetwork.com and familiarizing yourself with all of them. If you would like to support the show, please do. Patreon.com/Michael Garfield. I know attention doesn't scale, which is why I have committed myself to the cultivation of a small, focused, high-quality community of listeners with this show and paid subscribers, and I would love for you to be a part of it if that's the kind of conversation that inspires you. Thanks for listening, and I'll have another awesome conversation for you next week.